Behind every royal headline, there's a hidden truth. The world is watching the crown once again. This is Golden Crown Insider, where royal secrets become headlines. Today we are going back. Not to the scandals of today, not to the headlines of this week, not to the drama currently playing out in California or in the corridors of Westminster. Today we are going all the way back to a marriage that lasted 73 years, that survived wars and crises and conspiracies and the slow, grinding weight of history itself. A marriage that the world thought it understood completely. And a man who right up until his final days was hiding a truth so personal, so quietly devastating, that even the people closest to him never fully grasped its depth. We're talking about Prince Philip. And the marriage that cost him everything. Subscribe right now if you are new here. Hit that bell. Because this is the story behind the story of the greatest royal partnership of the 20th century. And nothing about it is what you think. Let's start at the very beginning. Because to understand who Philip was inside that marriage, you first need to understand who Philip was before it. And that story begins not in a palace, not in England, but on a small Greek island. In chaos. In exile. In a fruit crate. Philip was born in 1921 on the island of Corfu. A prince of Greece and Denmark by title. But the title meant almost nothing because within a year of his birth, the Greek monarchy had collapsed completely. His entire family was forced into exile. And Philip, barely a baby, was smuggled out of the country, hidden inside a fruit crate on a British naval vessel. That image. A prince. In a fruit crate. Being smuggled out of his own country before he could even walk. That image tells you everything you need to know about the foundation on which Philip built his entire life. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece, chose a life of self-exile and essentially vanished. His mother, Princess Alice, suffered a mental breakdown and was sent to an institution. By the age of 10, Philip was being passed from relative to relative, from one boarding school to another, with no permanent home and almost no parental guidance. News a prince. With no home, no parents, no stability. Just structure, the cold, disciplined, unfeeling structure of naval colleges and boarding schools and distant relatives who kept him alive but never made him feel loved. What those institutions offered was discipline. And so Philip learned very early, in the way that only a truly abandoned child can learn, that strength and silence were the only tools he had. Emotions were weakness. Feelings were dangerous. Duty was everything. News carry that with you. Because that lesson, learned in childhood, hardened through war, calcified through decades of royal life, that lesson shaped every single thing that happened inside his marriage to Queen Elizabeth II. When Philip joined the Royal Navy in 1939, he finally found something he had been searching for his entire life. Purpose. Identity. A role that was entirely his own. He was not a displaced prince. He was not someone's inconvenient relative. He was a naval officer. A commander. A man who gave orders and had them followed. A man who thrived in combat, climbed the ranks through genuine ability, and for the first time in his life, was the author of his own story. And then he married Elizabeth. And the story was taken from him. When Elizabeth became queen in 1952, less than 5 years into their marriage, everything changed overnight. Philip had to give up his naval career. The one thing that had given him his identity, his purpose, his sense of self. He could not give his children his last name. He could not run his own household. He walked several meters behind his wife on official engagements. He knelt at her feet during her coronation. He said himself, "I thought I was going to have a career in the Navy, but it became obvious there was no hope. There was no choice." News no choice. Those 2 words. From a man who had spent his childhood with no choices, who had finally built a life where he called the shots and then had it taken away. Not cruelly. Not deliberately. But completely. True Royalty TV co-founder Nick Bullen, who worked closely with Philip on a documentary commemorating his 90th birthday, described how Philip understood his role as guardian. He spoke of being a real guardian around the Queen, protecting her, making her passage as monarch easier. He was the icebreaker. When Philip walked into a room, the tension lifted. And then when Elizabeth arrived, everyone was calm. ABC News the icebreaker. The tension lifter. The man who walked into rooms first so that by the time the Queen arrived, the hard work was already done. That was Philip's job. That was his contribution. Real, essential, irreplaceable, and almost entirely invisible. And invisibility, for a man like Philip, was its own kind of punishment. Historian Robert Lacey, who served as a consultant for Netflix's The Crown, revealed something that surprised many people. Within the private marriage, behind the public protocol that always showed Elizabeth as the monarch and Philip as the secondary figure, it was Philip who was actually in charge of virtually everything. The household, the estates, the children's education, the practical running of royal life. In public, Elizabeth led. In private, Philip ran everything. Yahoo, and yet the world never saw that. The cameras never captured it. The newspapers never reported it. Because the story was always Elizabeth. Always the Queen. Always the crown. Philip was the shadow behind the throne. And shadows, no matter how essential, are defined by what they stand next to, not by what they are. Now let's talk about what that shadow cost him. Because this is where the story becomes genuinely heartbreaking. Author Giles Brandreth, a close personal friend of both the Queen and Philip, revealed new details ahead of what would have been the Queen's 100th birthday. He described Philip's loyalty to the Queen as complete. And yet, that same loyalty was tested, publicly and repeatedly, by rumors of infidelity that haunted their marriage for decades. The Royal Observer royal author Ingrid Seward, who has covered the royal family since the 1980s and written over 20 books on the subject, investigated the affair allegations in her book My Husband and I, the inside story of 70 years of royal marriage. The allegations ranged from relationships with other members of social circles to famous actresses and models. None were ever proven. But the rumors never fully disappeared either. Hello. Brandreth revealed how frustrated Philip was by these rumors. He was so angry at the persistent claims that he initially wanted to take legal action against those spreading them. The Royal Observer, a man of silence. A man who had spent his entire life swallowing his feelings, accepting his role, walking behind his wife without complaint. And the one thing that finally made him want to fight back publicly was the suggestion that he had been disloyal to the woman he had sacrificed everything for. That tells you something profound about what he valued most inside that marriage. Not his titles. Not his position. His loyalty. His devotion. The one contribution he could make that was entirely his own. And then there was the question of fatherhood. Because Philip's relationship with his children, especially with Charles, is one of the most painful subplots in this entire story. Philip was from a generation that viewed emotions as weakness and parenting as discipline. He wanted his children to be tough, to be leaders, to understand duty above all else. But Charles was a sensitive boy who felt smothered by his father's expectations and deeply misunderstood by his stern approach. Philip pushed Charles toward Gordonstown, the same rigid Scottish boarding school Philip himself had attended. Charles famously described it as a cult in kilts. Philip saw it as character building. Charles experienced it as something close to torment. News two men. Father and son. Both carrying wounds that the other could not see. Both speaking a language the other could not hear. And in between them, decades of distance that neither fully knew how to cross. Philip never fully learned to be the father Charles needed. And Charles never fully learned to be the son Philip expected. And that failure, quiet, painful, lasting, was one more thing that Philip carried in silence. In 2017, Philip retired from public duties. And for the first time in over 60 years, he was free. He moved to a farm on the Sandringham estate, a modest cottage by royal standards. Away from Buckingham Palace. Away from the cameras. Away from the protocol that had defined every waking moment of his life since 1952. He could read. He could paint. He could manage the estate. He could have friends over. He could simply breathe. News, and here is the quiet paradox at the heart of their marriage. The thing that their closest friends and family had always known, but that the outside world never quite understood. The secret of their 73-year marriage, according to Nick Bullen, was mutual respect, understanding, and space. Not constant togetherness. Not shared bedrooms and shared schedules and shared everything. Space. Room to be separate people. Room for Philip to be Philip, not just the Queen's husband. ABC News, they talked on the phone constantly when apart. The Queen visited Sandringham when she could. They spent every holiday together. And those who knew them best said they seemed most at ease, most genuinely themselves, when they had been given the room to miss each other. That is not a failed marriage. That is a marriage that understood something most marriages never do. That two people can love each other completely and still need to be apart. But as Philip's health declined in those final years, as his world shrank and his appearances became rarer, and the wood farm cottage became his entire universe, the weight of everything he had carried began to show. Not in dramatic confessions. Not in tearful interviews. Philip was not that kind of man. He was never going to sit across from an Oprah and explain his feelings. He showed it in the way he had always shown everything. In silence. In distance. In the quiet withdrawal of a man who had spent his entire life giving and had finally, at 99 years old, run out of things left to give. His final years were marked by a desire for peace that had eluded him for most of his life. The stiff ceremonies were gone. The protocol was gone. The walking behind was gone. What remained was a man with his books, his horses, his modest cottage, and the knowledge that he had done what he set out to do. He had protected the queen. He had served the crown. He had done his duty. News whether it made him happy whether, at the end of 99 years of sacrifice and service and silence, Philip felt that what he had given was worth what he had received in return. That is the question that nobody can answer. Because Philip never answered it himself. And that silence, that final, permanent silence, is perhaps the most Philip thing of all. Because here is the hidden truth about Prince Philip that this story has been building toward. The world mourned him as the Queen's devoted husband, as the steady hand behind the throne, as the man who gave up everything for duty. And all of that is true. But what history has been slower to acknowledge is the cost of that devotion. The naval career never lived. The identity never fully formed. The father-son relationship never healed. The man who survived exile and war and abandonment as a child, only to spend the entirety of his adult life being told to stand slightly behind, speak slightly less, shine slightly dimmer. He did it. He did it with loyalty that never wavered and commitment that never broke. And in doing it, he built something that lasted 73 years and outlived them both. But somewhere inside all of that duty and devotion, there was a man. A complicated, brilliant, difficult, funny, wounded, proud man who deserved his own story. And who, for most of his life, was not allowed to have one. That is the hidden truth today. And it is one of the most human stories the Crown has ever held. If this video moved you, give it a thumbs up right now. Share it with someone who thinks they already know this story. And if you have not yet subscribed to Golden Crown Insider, do it now. Every single day, we bring you the truth behind the royal headlines. The ones that reveal what this family is truly carrying beneath the crown. This is Golden Crown Insider. And we will see you in the next on.